Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the RadioFWD Podcast. My name is Sean Goralnik, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Meghan Sutherland to the show. Meghan Sutherland is a professor at the University of Toronto's Cinema Studies and Visual Studies program. She teaches courses on society and spectacle and a course called Picturing the Suburbs. I also, when I was looking for people to interview, people to talk to in the University of Toronto's Cinema Studies catalog, I saw your course called Monsters, and I had just seen 28 Years Later, and that definitely kickstarted my obsession with thinking about zombie movies and whatnot. So I am very excited to introduce Professor Meghan Sutherland. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me, Sean.
So, like I said, we wanna cover a little bit of everything and find out why you teach a course on monsters, what makes monsters, the portrayal of monsters, and in mass media and in cinema so interesting to you, what it has to say about your theories on aesthetics and politics. And also, obviously, I want to get to talking about 28 Years Later, which I loved, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts on it, how it differs from previous portrayals of zombies in cinema. But real quick, I would love to just get an introduction to your perspective on film, what sort of classes you teach, and how do you organize your thoughts on cinema? Like, what is the driving force behind the theories that you teach in course?
Well, I think the interests that drive my work as a whole, and I always like to keep my teaching in close contact with the things I'm thinking about in my research. I would say that these questions have to do with the role that the aesthetic dimension of representation plays in modes of representation that we don't think of as having a stylistic dimension, or they're meant to be fully transparent, one to one, right? What you see is what you get. And I'm thinking of things like science and democracy. So, in a lot of ways, my work traces the kind of diagonals and the kind of movement of images across these domains between entertainment and science and politics. And I try to write about the ways in which, in particular, the aesthetic dimension of representation shapes our idea of transparent representation, which is a kind of counterintuitive thing, right? It's supposed to be like on an interview right now, right? You take for granted, although we know very well now that there's editing and all of that, and there's some level of curation of guests and things like that. But you can take it to be relatively clear that I exist and we had this conversation. And obviously, all of this is thrown into question by AI. And so I'm interested in the aesthetic codes that have contributed to the idea that there is such a thing as technological representation that gives you a direct one-to-one encounter with the reality portrayed. And so my work is about popular entertainment and the mediation of very important ideals like justice and peace and social unity. And above all, the figure that is most central to all of these domains of representation that are meant to not have an aesthetic dimension, right? The sciences and politics, as I said initially. I'm interested in their relationship with popular entertainment and spectacular entertainment in particular. So, where does the history of spectacle and the most grotesque kind of modes of like really low culture, things that are discredited, things barely anyone has ever studied? I'm interested in how those cultures and debates and the way people relate to them as entertainment has also shaped our understanding of democracy and scientific truth. So that would be the kind of driving force. And so all my courses touch on that in one way or another, whether I'm talking about the melodramatic dimension of political discourse, right? That we all have these extreme emotions and, investments, and there are certain codes for representing them. Or the monsters class, for example, or any number of other classes that deal with the history of entertainment. I have a class about reality TV and as a mode of governance that is meant to kind of help mediate governing relations in society. So, all these things that seem really boring and without style and fun, that's what I show, that there's always been this spectacular dimension underpinning our understandings of them.
Wow. So I know that there in the at least in the film enthusiast world, there is now a growing fascination with genre filmmaking, looking back into lowbrow B movie type movements from the past, and you can create. I'm always fascinated with this, the through line of cinema history and how one film bounces off one another. But particularly in genre filmmaking, there is a constant kind of tribute that happens with every new
Yeah,
film that comes out. References, shots that are shared between the different films, between the various masters, or however you want to refer to it as. There is a sort of canon even amongst what you might consider lowbrow aesthetics. Not you, I mean, like anyone might consider lowbrow lowbrow aesthetics in filmmaking, like the B movie, like the genre flick, like the zombie movie, for instance, which we'll get into.
yeah.
Um, so this kind of brings us perfectly to Danny Boyle and 28 Days Later, because I think one of the things that keeps bringing people back to that film is that it was so bold in its introduction of a new form of technological representation, which was,
Mhm,
in my opinion, digital filmmaking. The
mhm,
like consumer grade use of consumer grade cameras in that film, the found footage
mhm,
style that was then, the tradition was kept on with like Blair Witch Project and 28 Days Later,
mhm,
and so that there's like something that Danny Boyle clicks into with the images that we receive in media, in particularly in news media, which we see at the beginning with the newsreel
mhm,
that's shown at the beginning of 28 Days Later, and then in the kind of the way that the film is shot, which is using pretty much the same cameras, the digital cameras that the news media was using in the early 2000s. What is Danny Boyle trying to get at there, maybe? And what do you have to say about the technological representation that 28 Days Later uses?
Well, I mean, it's funny. Um, there were, of course, a lot of films that experimented with these consumer technologies in this period, and so it was really one of many. I mean, I love mumblecore films. I don't know if you've gotten into that, kind of aesthetic grouping yet, but a lot of really interesting films that were, in many ways, related kind of networks of filmmakers who were all exploring. Consumer technologies in this period. And I think there was obviously a lot of power in using the media that seemed to be suddenly shaping a major shift socially. And I think what he was really on the leading edge of was, I mean, I think that 28 Days Later, having looked back at it, just last night, actually, I hadn't seen it since it came out. Um, and and I was struck by how much that film, and of course all the reviews mention this of 28 years later, how much it kind of intuited the way that the use of like digital media culture, the rise of a digital media culture. I mean, internet, like communication in a kind of ordinary texting mode was still fairly new at this point.
Mhm.
It was not the dominant mode by which people communicated. I barely had an email address when I was in college. Like it was all, dot matrix, kind of like, DOS um, aesthetics when I finished college in 2001. Um, and so this was very new technology by the time 28 Days Later came out in 2002, in fall of 2002 in the UK, it had its premiere. So I think intuiting the way that that would actually fuel a certain sense of rage was a really novel intuition and observation. And from the point of view of the present, it looks positively prescient. So I think that he is working with the medium that he understood to be reshaping affect and communication and social relations very directly, and coming out of like the cable news 9/11 moment in which the film was actually made, I think he was feeling these forces pretty palpably, and you can see that. So in the current version, which I understood, there's some inconsistencies in the way people have reported it, but from what I understand, he shot basically the entire film on an iPhone 15.
Right.
Um, and you feel that even more palpably now. And of course, he's sort of connecting the dots for us between the consumer level news broadcasting stuff that was meant to produce these effects in that period, right? Before cell phones and smartphones and social media were the main means by which we consumed information and about reality and urgent events. So if that was a critique of the digital media culture of news transmission, in that moment. I think now it is about social media and the kind of cultures, the affective cultures that have arisen from them. And I know I don't think I have to tell anyone we live in an age of rage and sensationalism, and so I think it's really interesting to look back and think about how much technology is a driver in human transformation and how we feel and what we think and how we relate to one another. And this film is sort of diagnosing that and trying to use the medium that produces these effects as the messenger of them.
I mean, obviously, there's an incredible scene with Eric, the Swedish soldier, that gets
Yeah.
stuck on the island and finds out that his phone has turned into a brick, which I think again is very prescient. Also, the same phone that he's using to shoot the very film that we're going to be discussing. I want to go back just a little bit and specifically to your course on monsters. There have been, like I mentioned, a plethora of portrayals of zombie apocalypses, zombies as the main villain, but there's always kind of an underpinning of like humanity as the kind of a mirror to that as a
Mm-hmm.
villain in all of these films, or in some other way. There's always human transmission and the fear of disease that is kind of undertailing all of these films. But first of all, where does this portrayal of zombies come from in cinema history? And what would you say is different about Danny Boyle's zombies than the ones that we might have seen from Romero or from uh, the body invasion of the body snatchers, or even Walking Dead?
I mean, I think it's really such an interesting question. And I mean, in terms of the beginnings of zombie culture, there is certainly the sort of origin stories of zombies come from voodoo culture. The way that I teach these films in my classes, and I think this is most relevant for the George Romero kind of mode, and Romero really originated the modern version of the genre, is kind of widely recognized to have done that with Night of the Living Dead, and then the 24 films that followed it of varying degrees of distribution
Quality.
and yeah, yeah, and many kind of jammed towards the final years of his career. For me,
Sure.
these are the gold standard. I place Romero's zombie films at the very like peak of cinematic history and
Mhm.
accomplishment. I think these films are not even fully understood yet, and so I make it my business to try and help with that. But in terms of the kind of narratives that I think he picked up on very clearly, and he invokes through his characters in the dialogue of that film, is that it emerges from voodoo, from the culture of voodoo in the Caribbean, and the language of having, of becoming someone's horse,
Mhm.
essentially, that you get possessed by another spirit. And if you read this history in the way that, as I began to say, I teach zombie films with Zora Neale Hurston's incredible book of ethnography and personal reflection called Tell My Horse, which was published originally in 1938. And a lot of people here, who are watching, probably remember reading Zora Neale Hurston's novels, perhaps in high school AP English classes. I certainly did. Their Eyes Were Watching God, and
Mhm.
all of these really great works, but Tell My Horse is a masterpiece as well. And it finds Zora Neale Hurston as a Black woman, from living in the Harlem Renaissance era, trying to kind of chart and understand the Caribbean cultural ways that kind of inform her culture in the Americas, and her everyday life, and is reporting, therefore, as a stranger to this culture and going to Haiti, going to lots of places and listening to people talk about zombies. And she writes this beautiful ethnography that is also sort of mediating between this sort of the way that empowered Black people talk about zombies in Haiti and in other kind of cultures that embrace the kind of culture of voodoo, and also the way knowing exactly how the kind of racist culture of America and the sort of white mainstream is going to relate to what she's telling. So she's navigating a very interesting terrain, and you find that in her book. But at any rate, what you see there, if you read Tell My Horse, is a history of slavery being understood and interpreted through the kind of traumatic narrative lens of one day my relatives were here, they were sleeping, they were loved, I knew them. The next day they were kidnapped and I saw them working in a field like a beast. They were made into a beast. This is no longer a human. I would like to get them back, right? And it's
Right.
very traumatic for people. So it is really, I think, a narrative cultural way of producing profound political violence and dehumanization. And so this is, I think, a culture that attaches itself very strongly to any good zombie film, and has historically, and especially through Romero's careful treatment of it, but it lingers even in the more recent versions, like you say, that I think Boyle and certainly the remake of Dawn of the Dead in the early 2000s, around the same time, 2004, I believe. All of these films with fast zombies that kind of update the figure of the zombie away from Romero's and start sending it on a trajectory that looks a bit different and that leads more in the direction of where 28 years later joins back into the tradition. So yeah, there's a lot of generic codes here. And, I think Romero was dealing with television as a kind of an ascendant technology in a new way when he was making his films. So there's always a little bit of technological transformation, I think, built into these films and a reflection on what it does to our understanding of who we are and how we relate to each other and what we owe each other. And
Sure.
that comes through
Uh,
in all of them.
obvi- Obviously, Danny Boyle isn't operating under the same trauma as the stories from Tell My Horse. But what is it about the symbol of a zombie and losing your human autonomy, being infected in some way? What like that can be applied to stories like the ones that Romero and Danny Boyle are telling. So there's
Mm,
something about the semiotics of zombies that works well, regardless of if you're talking about the trauma of slavery or if you're talking about consumerism and you're talking about kind of societal hive minds or societal collapse. But there's still like, despite the stories being so different, the symbol
mhm.
of the zombie still works so well. Uh, what
Yeah.
kind of anxieties are they getting at, all of these authors and artists who are working under this symbol?
I mean, I think that they're getting at what does it mean to be a human being? How important is that? Like to begin with, as a kind of point of pride or distinction from other beings? And what do we owe each other as fellow human beings? And what happens when the line begins to shift?
Mm,
And what kinds of violence are okay? I think that the Romero films, for example, are so violent because they are all about the ethics of killing these people and what it means to have somebody pointing a gun in your face. And the lead protagonists are always Black in these films, pretty much, and it's no mistake, obviously. And a lot of them are especially sensitive to the experience of having somebody approach them and talk to them with a gun in their face.
right.
And so like really dwelling on this and really dwelling on the violence and the ease of the transitional moment when one becomes a zombie. right? That it is a transitional, that is a contingent position, that one is not essentially a zombie, raises other questions, right? What if they could be changed back? Are you killing a person? But it's also, I think, a sense of betrayal by people in your life. And certainly now, um, as a number of people have kind of reread a lot of these zombie narratives through the lens of like political tension and estrangement in the US especially, where it's like I was talking to my father and then he ate my head and attacked
Right,
me
right.
and took away my rights. So
Sure.
I mean, what counts? Who gets to vote? Who is a human mind worthy of having rights? These are questions that emerge in zombie cinema through the lens of slavery because they concern race. And I think it filters back always into the Danny Boyle um, version of these films, this genre later on, because of course in this film we have the introduction of an idea of evolution among the zombies, that they are changing,
Alpha.
um, that we now have the alpha, and also that zombies can have reproductive lives, and that a
Mm,
zombie can get pregnant, and also that when a zombie has a child, for example, that child in this case in the film 28 years later is not a zombie, spoiler
mhm.
alert. So what does it mean to kill a person carrying a child? I mean, really, even understanding that person as a zombie, if that zombie lady tried to, if somebody killed that zombie lady in America today, it would be like fine to kill her, but they would be put in jail because she was carrying a baby.
Right.
And so, what do lives mean? Who counts? How
Yeah.
many beings? Which ones matter? These are the
Mm.
questions still today. And I think we're constantly negotiating these kind of very real ethical questions with extremely grave consequences.
Sure, and the imagery of the UK under quarantine obviously calls back to the pandemic and something that we've all dealt with in the last 5 years. Not to hammer on this point, everyone knows about the pandemic, but I'm just saying, like, uh, what I mean is more about the ethical decisions that were being made about, who are we saving, quite literally,
Hmm.
and these are the same sort of questions. I think you're absolutely right that are being asked in 28 years later. Yeah, who counts exactly?
And
I don't.
not just that. I
Yeah,
mean, I think with this film, just to jump in and add even more layers to what you're saying, absolutely the pandemic is just like palpable in
yeah,
this film and in all of our experiences every day, even when we beat it down and repress it.
yeah.
Um,
That's
but still healing. But I think in addition to that, Brexit is the other elephant in that
sure,
particular room.
absolutely.
Watching England be quarantined from the rest of Europe. As
Right.
Europe goes on, Britain is quarantined, Britain is isolated, Britain is engulfed by rage. So, yes, we can say more of that about that, I'm sure. But just to add that to that layer of imagery of England being quarantined.
I think in each of the films, even 28 Weeks Later, which doesn't involve Danny Boyle or Alex Garland, but in each of these films, there is a mass, like, cultural trauma that is being worked
Hmm.
through. I think in 28 Days Later, the England joining the Afghanistan war and, the
Hmm.
on the cusp of the Iraq War and receiving the images back home, which for this generation that was, teenagers or potentially getting enlisted or joining the war, that this film was coming out, they obviously don't have the history of like Vietnam or something like that, right? So this is
Hmm.
like their first, maybe not necessarily first encounter because there was the Gulf War and everything, but I'm saying like
Hmm.
the sheer number of vivid imagery, it's pretty much the first time that that sort of thing has happened on a mass
Yeah.
scale like that. And again, if we're bringing technology back into the conversation, these are these images are only going to be more prescient and easier to capture. It's going to be harder to avoid these images. They show up on our social media feeds, pretty much live streamed, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and then you go to 28 Weeks Later, which I think also still tackles war imagery. I mean, the entire film is pretty much shot through a sniper lens, right? There's like so many shots through a sniper lens in that film, or surveillance cameras. That was another like a burgeoning
Hmm.
technology. the mass surveillance state, feeling like we're reopening society and you're all being watched in this panopticon of CCTV cameras. That's
Mhm.
pretty much the entire film takes place through these cameras. And now 28 years later, they are so far detached and they are literally almost starting from like the Iron Age or Stone Age, making their own arrows and
Mhm.
hoarding resources that they're scraping by, and they're going back on the mainland to hopefully loot some resources back home. That I think the progression works so beautifully in this series, even though 28 weeks later is not the original author or anything, but it just as a whole package, I think it works so well. So how do you feel about 28 years later? Did you enjoy it?
Um, I have to be completely honest that I didn't love it. I definitely can see what's interesting about it, but I found it profoundly boring and extremely uneven. Um, and I don't get bored easily. Like I watched Warhol's Sleep with no problems. Like,
Okay.
I can find interest. Like it's so rare. This is why I actually felt like sad and like I was like, what's wrong? Maybe I just saw it on the wrong night. But I really didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy the aesthetic. That's my like, and I didn't find that it was able to do enough with the things. I thought it was so interesting, all the things it's bringing together. So I see a
Mhm,
lot in the film, but to me, it also, I think, in reflecting on what about it doesn't work for me, I think it was so invested in retroactively building a franchise, both
mhm.
projecting backwards and forward, that there's not a lot of there. It's like preparing for the next film, which has already been shot,
That's totally fair.
preparing for this or that. And in that way, it feels for me, I have no problem with like the most commercial types of filmmaking making fun of themselves. Like, I watched Abbott and Costello's Frankenstein with my nephew like last winter, and I actually hadn't seen that one, but it's one of the many like kind of hardcore B films that was just sort of extracted violently from the successful monster movies of the early kind of Universal horror period, and it's fun and it's interesting. It's like I had a whole theory about that film and why it was like reflecting on its own obvious like structural role in this genre filmmaking tradition
Mhm.
in really interesting ways. And I found that super interesting, and so I think for this I felt it was in fact more poisoned by the franchise economics of the contemporary film industry than I had hoped. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So we have lots to talk about. I'm not trashing it. It's just for
No, sure.
me, it just I really did not love watching it. Like it's
Yeah.
that simple for me. It's not
Mm.
anything,
I
so
I wonder I
and
wonder if you
thinking
can
about it.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, like you're saying, you can obviously find interesting things to talk about in it, but I'm more
Yeah.
curious about the what missed with the aesthetics. Uh, like, if you can articulate that, I'm very curious.
I mean, it's possible that I simply hate the world that it's talking about so much that I can barely, like,
Yeah.
as I normally am good at removing myself from that experience. Like, I mean, another way to talk about these films and the trajectory from, you know, even, in much earlier zombie film, like I walked with a zombie, Jacques Tourneur's film from the 1930s, one of the earliest Hollywood zombie films, which is a film I love. It's so good. Go watch it. But from even this era, that's a film about slavery. Also, it's about the sugarcane economy in the Caribbean, and the lingering kind of effects of colonial culture, even on the psyche of the white settlers, and the aristocracy that's running the plantations. All of this, even at this point, I think can also open onto another way to understand the trajectory through the appeal and interest of zombie cinema in all these iterations, which is a way of relating to masses of people. We get these anxieties about zombies also from the idea of crowds, masses, which is one of the kind of great anxieties of the modern era. You have a lot of anxious accounts of the crowd and the madness of the crowd and how they become unhuman. That a human can lose their human characteristics and judgment when they're involved in a crowd.
Right.
And so there's a lot of 19th century mass psychology writing. Gustave Le Bon is the most famous. I teach these texts as well in my classes, that really describe crowds as something like zombies, these mindless, violent, emotion driven people with no reason. So we could think about the Romero films are also, in fact, about the Vietnam era and about the rise of television. And those films treat the culture of television as a key subject throughout, especially Dawn of the Dead, which is just a masterpiece. And then later versions also take up the internet. In this one, I think what we have is very much a version of the zombie narrative that has to do with the radically changing characteristics that we attach to mass numbers of people. We no longer think of them as acting in coherent, predictable ways, right? In the era when Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead was made, and we were talking about the rise in a new way of broadcast culture and this worry of unified mind control, of people being brainwashed by the messages of mass media and like ceasing to think except in these genres and tropes, right? Which is really
Mm.
what the zombie film is about. And moving slow. That's a slow moving idea of the masses, and they're more or less all the same, right? They're more or less victims of the same kind of condition, and you can kind of predict what they're going to do. And the trickle down is slow, right? With Boyle's era, and with particularly with his treatment here, it is about speed. And I think that's the right diagnosis. So putting it on iPhones, to me, what shapes the rage culture in a different way now is the increasing monetization of attention. Right, this has always been a theme also in modern history and culture of media, and now, of course, we know it's not news. You don't have to be a media scholar to know how getting your news through social media sends you down rabbit holes with into kind of echo chambers of people who think the same way and more intense versions. There's a kind of planned addiction effect that keeps you in a rage loop, that keeps you going down a rabbit hole of like shock.
Yeah.
And whether you're on the progressive side or the conservative side, you're going to see things more and more that seem insane, that drive you crazier and crazier.
Yeah.
And I think that treating this through the iPhone in this film is obviously a way of talking, of literally kind of in a literal way, showing that phones are the technology that conducts rage,
Mm.
that conducts the culture of rage,
Yeah.
and that it is driven by these kinds of larger forces of the commodification of our feelings and our reactions, right? And at a hyper level, but people are also disaggregated. So the math is no longer acting in a predictable way,
Right. They're
and the
very
information indoctrinates so much faster and cascade information, misinformation cascades, all of this. So the speed with which the image appears on an iPhone 15, right? And the cutting, the dizzyingness, the disorientation that comes from the iPhone, and the way that it sensationalizes every killing no longer is a matter of ethical contemplation of like, is it right to kill this person? It's about being gross. It's
Mm.
about happening fast. It's about producing shock, because that is the media culture that is diagnosing, and the concept of the masses as this unpredictable, ununified, high speed, highly volatile entity with like 1,000 million cats in bags, real pissed cats. So something like that. I think aesthetically, it is capturing the culture of speed and rage at the level of the aesthetic. And I salute you, Danny Boyle. It's the correct thing to do, but I simply hate watching it. And I also can say, I can add to this that I think the other reason that I'm traumatized by this aesthetic is because it does harken back to a moment that he's always been known for making like punk rock films, Train Spotting. It's always been in your face,
Absolutely.
shocking stuff. And I like those. I love a lot of Danny Boyle films. I loved Train Spotting. I mean, I was, a kid, but like great. It was really great and really interesting. I remember. I loved 28 Days Later. I love Sunshine. I think
One of
it's
my favorites. It's in my top three.
incredible, incredible film.
Absolutely.
So, and I loved The Beach even. I thought The Beach was really good, really interesting in its moment for what it was doing. So, but at the same time, all of that aesthetic that he has now become known for, and that comes back, I think, in a much more aggressive way than in the first one, having just watched that one last night. I was thinking that one was more this way. It's how I think of Danny Boyle. I was surprised how much more chill the aesthetic of that film is, much less focused on the shock of the outrage of the moment of impact and things like this. The tones, I think, were very much like the news culture, and the way it had that texture in a really pronounced way, but it was not as much, with this sort of shock and awe aesthetic of like hyper fast cutting that you get from using 20 iPhones to shoot a
Yeah, yeah,
film.
yeah, yeah, right. Those
So
Matrix style video game kills that loop
yeah.
around zombies that accentuate the kill, the moment
Hmm.
itself, which is, I think, reminiscent of the images that we might receive in these rabbit holes in these echo chambers
Hmm.
of decontextualized
Yeah.
moments of warfare or of
Hmm.
genocide. Instead, just the moment of violence itself, completely
Yeah.
recontextualized as a way of radicalizing you or keeping you in
Yeah.
the feedback loop. I wanted to touch briefly on your mention of tropes. I think in these echo chambers, they're always utilizing, rather than, like explicitly what happened, they're utilizing tropes. They're utilizing storylines to
Hmm.
tell these to further radicalize you. I always think of like QAnon as a great example because
Oh
QAnon,
yeah.
like, it was pretty much written like a sci-fi novel. The
Hmm.
ideology of QAnon and the heroes and it's very much like a fable almost. Now I also want to say that in 28 years later, Danny Boyle parlays this what he does in 28 Days Later with the newsreel at the start of the film
Hmm.
that's playing, that's
Hmm.
inducing the rage of the patient zero, of the monkey that is being
Hmm.
saved by presumably like environmental activists, which is another great point, or a great stroke by Danny Boyle, very funny. He parlays this image with the old war footage, that
Hmm.
the documentary style war footage that is being played as the Boots poem is
Hmm.
being performed, and the young father's score is reaching its crescendo, and they're crossing the causeway. Um,
Hmm.
why do you think it is that Danny Boyle took like old documentary footage and looked back to, you know, old film footage, old documentary footage, and maybe avoided using iPhone camera footage to highlight the similarities between their march on the causeway and the footage that we see from World War II, presumably?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting you draw these like parallels in each film. There's this opening with the experience of like newsreels, etc. Although they're also, I think, quite different in their effects, right? Because this chimp is being experimented on, subjected to all the things that we watch on cable news, right? And so in this moment, it is very much about the 24-hour news cycle and how monetizing the transmission of information commodifies it in a way that makes everything dependent on creating, you know, rage. I think it's just like very straightforwardly about that in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Um, I remember watching from a hotel room maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, and I being, a media scholar, like fully aware of all of these debates and everything. On CNN, there was like a plane that couldn't land, because they were like their wheels wouldn't come down and they were running out of gas, and it was just like broadcasting live this plane like circling trying to figure out what to do, and it was riveting, and you're just like so caught up in it, even though that you're just watching this completely. I mean, it was fine, like nothing happened
Yeah,
because they figured out like what to do or whatever, so anything can become news when you're looking to fill dead hours,
yeah.
and when you
Hard,
have new technology, you
right?
have, yeah. And I think that first one is very much about this, and I think it's also interesting that, I thought it's a brave choice of him to make it, uh, a film that also is calling into question the wisdom of some like activism. I say this with a huge amount of love and respect, and and I don't know, investment in the fact that young people are exploring the appeal of politics other than their parents. And I think that's the most interesting thing about the more recent film in a lot of ways. I think the headline of that film is like, you know, the most important thing in anyone's existence is to get the fuck away from their parents
Hmm.
and don't believe about the world that they, gave you. Don't
Sure.
trust it,
Like
right?
trying
And even if it means killing them, you know, you
to,
better kill your parents if you have to.
well,
And
fight
I love
to
this.
save his mother, right? And is
Yeah,
to bring him to Ray
at
Fox.
great risk, it
Right.
should be said, to carry
Right.
a very ailing woman into the, and we can say so much more about this, but to go back just to kind of tie this, thread together, before we go, we continue in the subject in a different
Yeah.
way, however you want. I would just say that the comparisons technologically, like, I think he's saying, like, yeah, actually, activism is great, but at the same time, when it's unthinking, when it's reactive, when it just does, and in the name of a radicalism that's never thinking, right? Like, that's not actually understanding what it's dealing with, that's purely reactive, that can be bad too. That's part of this world. And I don't think he lets, progressive energies off the hook here. This is also part of a culture of rage and, you know, unthinking action, without justification or plans, that's
Mhm.
not always heroic and great. And I think that's part of what he's diagnosing. In this more recent one, with the film newsreel footage, right? This is not indoctrinating anyone. This is not a torture device to, acculturate rage. This is more of a kind of editorial moment that I found quite sort of also a little jarring aesthetically. For some of the reasons probably that you're mentioning, but not really only. It's just when you have this kind of hyper realist aesthetic that he's going for with the iPhones, then you add in this heavy-handed commentary, and it's like, where are we? Like, what are we doing? What's the vibe here? And it's fine, but I think that he goes to those things, right? He's showing, in addition to the Rudyard Kipling poem, which is a kind of classic of British imperial and colonial, you know, um, masculinity and pride and all of these things. It's also showing us a lot of footage from Laurence Olivier's Henry V film. So I think it's also very much about the imagery of what it means in an honorable way in the history of British culture to be a man and to have power and to govern and to keep order. And the values that are being diagnosed here are slightly different. And I think that's where the kind of Brexit side of things comes in, and the imperial history of violence that does lie behind the British Empire and all of this. So I feel like there are a lot of different things happening here because it is a film about Brexit. It is about masculinity. It is about media, and this is one of the reasons why I think it can be all of these things because they're not unrelated, right? These men are growing up in this culture where you have, after all these years, you still have the same ideals, like we're going to go out on a hunt, we have these same handmade arrows. you
No.
know Things are not so different is the point. And there's nothing changing with progression. And I think that's another way of reading the zombie metaphor in this particular film, is the enduringness of these values even through the stormy weather of them being beaten back by anti-colonial resistance, by, continuing modernization and discourses of abandoning these kinds of imperial modes. All of these things are still operative, and the modes of masculinity are just as operative and exciting outrage about fake things that didn't happen in small towns in the 21st century, with digital media leading up to, for example, these recent kind of riots
Hmm.
in England that were produced strictly through conservative media circulating erroneous stories in small towns that made them go out and attack immigrants.
Right.
So this being really very much a local story and a general story and a technology story and a zombie story, the race part is still, of course, there with the oh no, that was the 28 Days Later, with the imprisoned soldier who
Oh
was
yeah,
black
of
by
course.
no mistake
Right.
whatsoever and
Right.
chained up. So some things never change, I think, is one of the many things, many, many things. They evolve, lots happening. Anyway, something
uh,
like that.
I think another element is to go back to your point about enduring masculinity or kind of rebuilding society or keeping
Hmm.
order, especially about keeping order.
Yeah.
Spike is undergoing essentially a coming of age ritual.
Hmm.
When he goes off with his dad into the causeway off the island, we get a brief mention. It's, oh, usually, he has to be 14 or 15. So this is clearly
Hmm.
a ritual now that they've created for way
Hmm.
of survival, a way of creating new soldiers, a way of, but it manifests itself like a coming of age ritual. He comes back and there's a huge party thrown for him. I'm,
Hmm.
I'm thinking like, yeah, I'm thinking of like a bar mitzvah. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
Uh,
Yeah.
he comes back and we see a quick shot of a banner that they've created, as well as shots of essentially it's not necessarily propaganda, but it's more like a recontextualized version of, maybe during World War II in British school children would probably learn about why their father has like gone to war. And
Yeah.
so we hear about the roles in society. We see the children's drawings of the farmer and and the soldier, right? And we see
Hmm.
that and it's drawn because the books don't have that portrayal. It's drawn separately by another child, presumably,
Hmm.
who and it's included in this shot of this party. There's also the banner, right, which is like
Hmm.
it says something like established in 2002. It
Yeah.
says something like it has the name of their town, and it has a slogan. To me, this is all imagery of like wartime propaganda.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
recontextualizing social order and the belief that during wartime propaganda or during wartime rather that you are fighting for social order, your own social order, however
Hmm.
whichever one that might be. And you're totally right. Spike is being thrust into the rigid masculine structures of the wartime era, of the World War II era, of any given wartime era. And I love this imagery. I think it's
All
so
eras.
yeah, eras,
All
all
eras matter. No.
eras. But that for me was very striking when he returns from what I like to call the coming of age ritual of the
Oh
film.
yeah, absolutely. But the way you're saying this says it all already. Coming of age ritual. If every new society has a coming of age ritual, then you're coming of age the same way over and over again for millennia, and that's part of how cultures define themselves. And in a lot of ways, that is exactly the repetitive life cycle that is aligned with zombieism, and so the idea that we're just going to like repeat our childhoods over and over again every time we restart, that we end up in the same place every time is, I think, one of the darker and sadder and, very interesting parts of what the film is, I think, trying to think about. And I mean, like, I loved that opening sequence. I was totally there for it. The Teletubbies, the kids, this kind of mixture of like wanting to keep your eyes on the Teletubbies, which who are very much identified with another certain kind of commodification of attention of children that starts earlier.
Yeah, right.
When they emerged, this was very much something people cared about. Now it's really not. Like we talk about screen time, but we feel guilty, and you just do it. Yeah. And anyway, and it's not like a public policy. Like in America, it's not even a thing anymore. You know, for example, I don't know about in England, but like, just like children, like advertising to kids is like not even a big deal anymore. It used to be a huge deal even in the 90s. So all of this is really about how quickly this like apocalyptic starting over reverts to the space of ritual, and how important ritual and repetition are to these things, such that you are just stuck in a loop, repetitive loop, just very much like a zombie. Um, so, I mean, I think the coming of age aspect, it's like we have all these really powerful and useful critiques of masculine ideals, and how they're changing. But I think it's been legitimately pointed out by a lot of people who are very invested in thinking about these issues, and the kind of obviously emerging sexual divide in politics today in the 21st century, in the age of new media, digital media that micro targets and sort of sorts female and male audiences into different kind of cultures and climates. I think these critiques of masculinity, of traditional masculinity, have been so important, but it's true that not many good models of like what it looks like to be a good young man. Like, what is a good model of masculinity today? Is it always bad, right? I think people are right to raise the question of, and the concern that like all the critiques of traditional masculinity in the absence of a new way of thinking about what it means, and who are our role models, who are the guys that embody what it means to be a man, where it's okay to be masculine, and it should be,
Yeah.
right? um, that like you have another way to think about what you're aiming for in life. And I think it can be very confusing to live in a world without that, where it feels like there's a lot of negative messages about, your who you are. So
Which might
I think all of these things are also at stake in this film. Is really, I think, smart to be trying to address the masculinity dimension. And I also think the first one was so ahead of the curve in recognizing how, in a moment of apocalyptic, whether environmental or social kind of crisis, um, like systematized rape is the next thing, right?
yeah.
That women actually suddenly become ready to be slaves. And so their status changes as well. And we see the attempt in 28 Days Later to rape by the military the two female characters in the film.
Yeah.
One of them a young girl. So anyway, I think this film really anticipates, and in a lot of ways, I'm sure it was already informed by Margaret Atwood's genius awareness of this reality that is what underpins her writing of the novel The Handmaid's Tale, which was written in
Mhm.
the Reagan era from Eastern Europe. So she had a lot of really prescient ideas about this, how this would go. And this film, I think, is embroidering on these gender dynamics also in super interesting ways.
I think most importantly, when Spike has the extended conversation with Ray Fiennes' character,
Hmm.
I think
Oh, yeah.
he might, he starts to, it's hard to explain, but he understands Ray Fiennes' point and gets a new perspective on Memento Mori, and then
Hmm.
also, remember you must live too, to let
Hmm.
go of past trauma, or let
Hmm.
go of um his mother's death and move
Hmm.
forward. You have to survive, you have to live, remember you have to live. But he takes that message as a means to like go off and be an individual, right? And like
Hmm.
survive in this hellscape essentially without guidance. He like took this
Hmm.
small conversation, brings the baby back to safety, and then just goes off into the wilderness. I kind of was lost there a little bit.
Yeah,
Um
me too.
what to make of that, especially because I was thinking about these, his rebellion against his father,
Hmm.
who um feels like he's lost his wife and his lover, and feels some
Hmm.
form of emptiness, and is looking
Hmm.
for a mistress to fill the void. And he, Spike, the character, is disgusted by this, and
Hmm.
but not just that, feels like his mother is still alive. That's the
Hmm.
difference. He knows what a human looks like when they're not alive, because they have to survive the humans that aren't alive, that are, you
Hmm.
know, the rape, infected with rage. But his mother, in some ways, is still there. She's still referencing school. She still knows who Spike is, and sees his father seemingly abandon his own mother.
Mm-hmm.
Tries to save her and bring her to a doctor, but then that conversation just loses me completely. I
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, these are the kinds of things I'm just like, what? You know, I mean, and also it's like if they could have done something slightly more interesting with this like classic fainting Victorian woman. I don't need everybody. I actually like I don't have any litmus tests. Like I was talking with my friend that I saw it with, and it's like there's like no women, and they're just like sick, simpering, crazy people who get like sort of dragged around until they like savagely murder someone when they're not even really thinking about it,
yeah,
like with like military tactics, you know, what's
yeah.
happening behind, I don't know, but what are we meant to do with all of that? And what, like, I think the film gets right, the self-righteous rage of children. Like, kids are narcs. Okay, it's just like moralistic narcs. Don't trust them.
That's
Parents don't
funny.
trust your children. Um, and it's like I could imagine having I don't think that he had abandoned his wife just because he's fooling around and he doesn't know what to do. Whatever. It's not perfect, but it's like you could imagine giving some leeway to a person in this circumstance, and
Sure.
that that life is complicated for people, and what I think the betrayal is that the film is most interested in is that the dad has accepted the common wisdom that this doctor is crazy, and maybe he's been important to propagating it, to embracing it, and on some level because he was scared to go do that. I don't know. His dad doesn't seem like an altogether bad guy, if
Mhm.
you ask me. Like,
Right.
how moralistic do you have to be about a little bit of light adultery to decide that your dad is evil and like part of the problem,
Right.
and you're never going to talk to him again? It's like that's the time to say, in fact, grow up.
Right.
But and then it's equally, I mean, even weirder than that is the solution. And I mean, the other thing that's weird about the film to me is its investment. Um, in being parentless as the only way to be that's okay. Like all of the people who matter in this film are parentless, and it's sort of the flag. I mean, great, I'm glad, but it's like if this film has a message that I was saying to that same friend, like who run the world? Orphans,
Mhm.
like you have this absurd, like opening scene with this Jimmy, and you get the sense, and for me, I'm a huge Last of Us fan. So that's the other thing. It's like, are you really doing this? Should be better. The Last of Us is a goddamn masterpiece. So anyway, you see these murals, you think about militias and cultish presences, in this landscape of
Right.
this
Right. Right.
kind of lawless landscape. That seems
Masks
totally
too. I
realistic.
forgot to mention the masks.
Yeah. And you're like, okay, Jimmy, who's this Jimmy? Maybe it's a militia or some weird cult.
Mhm.
Um, and then you get to the end and you're like, I got this story at the beginning about this kid, for some reason, but you don't really know that's Jimmy. And then in force at the very end, you encounter this sort of crew of tracksuit wearing, chain wearing, martial artist, crouching tiger, hidden dragon, aided, leaping, killing force. So if killing the zombies is so wrong, why is it suddenly great when you get together with the other band of orphans and you're all out there doing it on your own? Like, I don't know what's going to come next, but I found that really irritating and weird. And just yeah, and so also, of course, I noticed rewatching 28 Days Later that his name is Jim. I remembered.
Oh yeah. Right.
The main, male character who is the one who's not in, he's invested in protecting women from getting systematically raped by the
Yeah. Right.
state.
And then the
He's one of the
portrayal
good
of
ones.
the portrayal of this like the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon militia, tracksuit wearing militia at the end, is also like people are drawing the comparison to Jimmy Cavill. Uh,
Mhm.
we don't have like enough context yet to comment on that, but I think that's
Yeah.
pretty much obvious with the freakish, like bright neon brown, blonde hair, and
Hmm.
that's kind of, I mean, it's just an evil, cheap evil that you can like symbolically say, okay, these guys are bad because they look like Jimmy
Yeah.
Cavill. So, but we
Yeah.
don't have enough context for that yet, obviously. But yeah, I'm very curious where this goes because I actually enjoyed the movie.
Yeah.
I thought the young father's score was so propellant and just like really
Yeah.
loved the music. I've been listening to
Oh
the
yeah.
soundtrack on its own outside of watching.
Mm-hmm.
I love the video game logic and the jittery editing, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
a I'm a boy at heart who grew up
I'm
with
not native to the generation. I think it's more of a generational thing. Oh, I did forget to finish saying though that the other thing that I think was a
yeah, yeah.
turnoff for me aesthetically is that that tracks for me as part of this rise of the new auteur, the bad boy auteur who's not afraid to do in your face violence. And it's very much Quentin Tarantino, Guy Ritchie, Danny Boyle moment of the rise of 90s auteurs.
Wanted to
That
ask you
like
that.
yeah.
I
So that was also the thing I was feeling is like that it's its own trope of masculinity, this type of filmmaking that doesn't like really come into question with the same rigor. Anyway.
maybe to close this off as a last question, I would like to bring that up. There's been, a number of genre films that have done very well recently. As I'm
Hmm.
thinking Substance, which catapulted the Midnight Madness
Hmm.
ideal upon. Yeah, I know that genre films have always done well, but I just mean as a kind of step up in how seriously they're taken. And that also happened with like the A24 elevated horror, uh,
Hmm.
like trauma baiting sort of movies that we get.
Hmm.
Alex
Yeah.
Garland's Men, for instance, I think is a great
Hmm.
example of that. I think Jordan Peele does a better version of that, but
Hmm.
I also think Jordan Peele's elevated horror, especially Ari Aster. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know if they are just trying to be taken seriously, even though they make silly movies,
Hmm.
or if they are trying to get at something beyond the limitations of B movies. Even
Hmm.
though through this discussion, how much have we talked about Romero and how little like Night of the Living Dead cost to make, and how obviously it's a B movie, it's lowbrow, but how
Hmm.
much it captures the like cultural zeitgeist at the time and how much it can commentate on race relations and police violence and losing your humanity. Yeah, I get lost in this like depiction of the elevated horror. And I get that 28 years later might be falling into that, which I didn't feel about 28 days later.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel it. I mean, I felt it uh um I felt it in the sense that like in the way that I mentioned before, it feels a little compromised to me by franchise logic. And in that sense, like the well has been poisoned because nobody is talking about, the renaissance in franchise films. Like they're certainly happening at a major clip, but the level of the quality associated with that has been going down further and further. Like now we have the mainstream discourse now is like more Marvel movies, more Marvel movies. Like how many do we need?
Mhm.
Um, uh, so, I mean, I think that that's not as palpable except in that level of expression. But I think that no, I think the genre films have always been like this, have always been important, and that serious people have always played with them. I mean, look at Douglas Sirk and melodrama. Like, here's another major genre institution, or Todd Haynes more recently, right? These are people who are, I mean, genre has always been interesting, and especially for horror, because just to come back to the question of the human, that is at the center of teaching about monstrosity as a genre, is that genre is a word that comes from the word genus, right? Which is a
Mhm.
taxonomic rank that tells us, you know, um, what somebody is, right? And what kind they are. And the kind of fascination with kind and typifying people according to the units of the social has a long history of violence, obviously, and so monster films are always toying with that as well. And the generic aspect of it is that it's always imprinting new genuses, right? And it's always kind of there with every evolutionary cycle to come back and treat the subject and the problem and the question about the borders of who we define as human differently. And so I think that's also true with emotion and morale and morality, in the way that melodrama or other genres could play with these things. So I do think there's a lot of great genre films now. All these films that you're talking about are so interesting. And this too, because the problems that recur are interesting problems, and they have to do with how we define the kind of integrity of the body, the typification, the identity of it, all of these things that somebody like Linda Williams was writing about in the 80s, even when she wrote her famous work on genres and body genres, in particular, like horror films that are supposed to
Mhm.
make you react physically. So, I mean, I don't know if there's a something more interesting. I also love Alex Garland's Civil War film. I think people mostly hated that film, and it's in no way a genre film. I think it's brilliant, though. Like, I think people are making all kinds of stuff, and I think they're taking genre more seriously, partly because of the commodified logics of audience discourse. And the same reason that franchise films and genre films get made is because people have recurring built in audiences to appeal to. And so the executives have a easier time selling it and like finding the right demographic unit. There's this little genus of people
Right.
who are interested. And then, amping them up to talk about it is part of the money making business of Hollywood today. So, yeah, I think having these kind of ongoing debates and baiting them in new ways is also a part of the apparatus that is um, trying to commodify the long-standing, always present interest of genre cinema, both for ordinary filmgoers and academics and filmmakers, So I would just say, yeah, I think that there's more stuff, but only I think we talk about it more partly because that's part of the bargain,
Mm.
you know, in the economy of filmmaking today.
Professor Meghan Sutherland, thank you so much for joining us. If you have something you'd like to plug, by the way, this is a great
Mm.
time to do it. And I also want to give a shout out that your course Monsters is returning next year. I'm not sure which semester yet, but if you are in the University of
Not
Toronto,
this coming year, the year after,
the
not
year
20, yeah, not fall 26, but fall 27 that year, I will be teaching this class again. Yes.
beautiful. So if you are in the cinema studies stream or visual media stream,
Mhm.
yeah, be sure to check out that course. But yeah, if you have anything to plug,
I mean, okay, so let me just give you three zombie films that
oh,
probably,
that's great.
I mean, I do think Jacques Tourneur's I Walked with a Zombie, I think it's
43.
1943. Yeah. Oh, look at me go. Okay. 1943, and really like very disturbing imagery from a sugar plantation of their image of a zombie in 1930, but I think very real. And I encourage you to read it with Zora Neale Hurston's Tell My Horse, which is an incredible book in its own right and gives you a different perspective on all of these debates and the culture of this imagery. Dawn of the Day, like I said, is like, I don't like ranking, I don't rank films. I don't say, I love so many films for so many different reasons and TV shows, etc. It's hard for me. But if I had to, definitely Dawn of the Dead would be one of them. I think it's the greatest of all of them. And it's a film about liberal governance and who counts as a human. And I think more recently, I mean, I would say, oh, I had another, oh, Day of the Dead is the one that is much less seen that I
Mhm.
would like to encourage people to see. I don't know if you've seen Day of the Dead.
I have.
It's a weird one, but it's I saw a new print of it at MoMA last summer
Oh,
actually.
pretty cool.
Incredible.
Like,
Wow. It's a film about how much people hate women, for one thing, like the mass levels of rage just being ready. And it felt really salient in the moment.
yeah.
Um, you know, but I think it's also a film that anticipates the idea that zombies are evolutionary beings and that their humanity could be expressed and considered in a different way through the figure of an evolving zombie, and the figure in that film that is the source of like training and scientific research I think it's really interesting, and it anticipates a lot of what's going on here with this interest in this pregnant zombie woman. I don't know what we're going to get coming out of that. I don't know how I feel about it. But, definitely something that could be interesting to engage. And it's just a brilliant film, however ugly, and of its moment in what it was critiquing very thoughtfully. A great genre film.
I will plug my one underrated zombie film as well, One Cut of the Dead, which is a very fast-paced meta movie about filming a zombie movie, which I think works very well with our conversation about technology and filmmaking in general. Finally, like, what's your favorite mumblecore film? Because or a mumblecore film that you'd like to shout out. Maybe not a favorite, but something you'd like to shout out because you mentioned it briefly.
So sensitive to not make me name it a favorite. Let me remind myself of the main options. Okay, I'm not a fan of Funny Haha, actually. I think LOL is an incredible one from 2006. And this one is the one I was thinking of. The Puffy Chair is also really good.
Oh, I've heard that.
Yeah, I would say LOL is a great way into that. And it's true. Happy Christmas also is a more recent one. Touchy Feely, that's one of the ones and Celeste and Jesse Forever also. That's great too.
Wonderful.
So just some fun things.
Yeah, awesome. I'll pop those up on the screen. Thank you again.
I'll text you the other one I was looking for if I can think of it.
Sweet. Okay, yeah, I'll be sure to add an author's note at the end. Professor Sutherland, thanks so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully maybe as 28 years later, parts 2 and 3 come out, somehow it will recontextualize or I don't know, that's a story that makes sense. But I'm on board with you that I wish it was just. I would have loved a 3-hour movie.
Oh, I would have done it, or make it a TV series. That's where a lot of long form, interesting work happens now. And as a TV, I'm not mad at that. So, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm also here for it. If it changes, maybe we'll revisit this.
Thanks.
But thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.